Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the College of Engineering's Distinguished Lecture for this academic year, 2009. And this is a terrific crowd and one of the most extraordinary opportunities we have to hear one of the world's leading engineers in a variety of areas. We'll hear about one area today, and I'm very thrilled that I'm going to be able to hear this and that we've been able to draw such a huge crowd. Which of course should be no surprise, having known Mal for many years and the quality of his work. Let me give you some introductory remarks about what's going on. By the way, for those of you who don't know, I'm Ken Luchin, Dean of Engineering. And let me begin. The College of Engineering's Distinguished Lecture Series celebrates high-impact research in engineering, and annually, this is the second annual one, honors one of our faculty engaged in outstanding research. This showcasing event is a public forum allowing all members of the university community to meet a distinguished scholar selected from the College of Engineering faculty discussing a topic of recognized excellence. Professor Malvin Teich received his bachelor's degree in physics from MIT, an MS degree in electrical engineering from Stanford University, and a PhD from Cornell University. Dr. Teich's first professional association was in 1966 with the MIT Lincoln Laboratory. He joined the faculty then of Columbia University in 1967, where he served as a member of the electrical engineering department and served as chairman there from 1978 to 1980. Mal has been a faculty member of Boston University since 1995, with appointments in electrical and computer engineering, biomedical engineering, and physics. He is director of the Quantum Photonics Laboratory and a member of the Photonics Center, the Center for Adaptive Systems, the Hearing Research Center, and the Program in Neuroscience. Maybe we should put them all together in one center. You can run the whole thing. He serves as a consultant to the government and private industry, and Mal is most widely known for his work in photonics and for his studies of fractal stochastic processes and information transmission in biological systems, the latter of which I presume we'll hear a lot of today. Professor Teich's recent research in quantum optics and the use of entangled light to develop new imaging technologies has led to several recent landmark advances in these fields. He and his colleagues invented and used for the first time ever a device that generates ultra-broadband, non-classical light for use in applications such as quantum optical coherence tomography, which promises improved resolution in the imaging of biological specimens. This work was featured on the cover of Optics and Photonics News, the December issue, that featured some of the most exciting and outstanding research being performed in 2008 in the world of optics. He and his research group at Boston University have also become the first to use quantum optical coherence tomography for the imaging of biological samples, another key step in the development of high-resolution medical imaging technology. The list of Mal's accomplishments and awards is long and distinguished, and let me just give you a few. He's a Life Fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering, IEEE, and a Fellow of the Optical Society of America, a Fellow of the American Physical Society, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Acoustical Society of America. Anything that starts with an A, Mal is a Fellow of. In 1969, he received the IEEE Browder J. Thompson Memorial Prize for his paper, Infrared Heterodyne Detection. He was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship in 1973, and in 1992 he was honored with the Memorial Gold Medal of, I'm going to get the phrasing wrong, Palacky University in the Czech Republic. He received in 1997 the IEEE Morris E. Leeds Award. He has authored or co-authored 350 journal articles or more, holds 6 patents, and he's the co-author of Fundamentals of Photonics, both the first and second editions with Baha Saleh, also one of our own, and of fractal-based point processes with S.B. Lowen, the latter of which, again, as I said, will be motivating much of today's talk. On a personal note, Mal is a fellow New Yorker who appreciates the occasional abruptness of speaking styles and the rate of speech that I'm accustomed to having with him. Please join me in congratulating Professor Mal Teich as this year's distinguished lecturer. Mal.
Thank you very much, Professor Luchin, and it is indeed a pleasure to be here. I'm actually on sabbatical this semester in California most of the time, which explains my tan color. And I'm, however, very happy to be back and miss a snowstorm. So it's good to be here. I would indeed like to talk about fractal point events. I often call them fractal point processes, but to make it a little bit simpler in hopes of drawing a larger crowd, I changed processes to events. It's a little less scary. And I'm going to talk about them in these three areas, or at least give examples in these three areas, and talk generally about the way that fractals are important. So let me begin by giving a brief outline of my talk. I'm going to be talking first about point events, and then talk about fractals and fractal point events. There are specific kinds of point events with certain properties. And then I'm going to talk about three examples in some measure of detail. One will be fractal photons, which is a rather new area that we haven't yet actually published on, but we have some results, preliminary results. I'm going to talk about heart rate variability, which is a way that fractals can be useful for determining whether or not there is some measure of cardiac dysfunction. And then I'm going to be talking about networks, in particular computer network traffic. I will mention some results we have there. And finally, I'm going to mention some things about sensory detection and what I'm up to right now. So let me begin by talking about counting point events in a fixed time window. If you have a bunch of point events, and I'm illustrating that here by the sequence of events right here, which is a fake Poisson process that I conjured up on the computer. And we have a time window t here, and typically that time window will scoot across, and we will count the number of events in each of the time windows as the time window passes across the entire point process. And then we can count the number of events, and they will be random, as you can see right here. And we will plot the probability of the number of events that we obtain versus the number of events. And we create a graph such as this, Poisson kind of a graph. This might look funny to some of you as a Poisson. It's because it's on a semi-log plot. If it were on a linear plot, we would have a simple bell-shaped curve. And we have the Poisson distribution plotted for various values of the mean. And the mean, of course, need not be integer. Here's a mean of 0.1, where we get mostly zeros and an occasional 1 with a probability of a tenth. And there's a formula for the Poisson distribution, which my students should all know, and many of you will know as well. And there's some properties of this distribution which are important because they form a benchmark for the kinds of fractal processes I'll be talking about. And one of the properties I'd like to talk about is the mean, which we've written here as lambda t. This is the n bar, the lambda t right here. And also the variance, which is the square of the standard deviation, a measure of the width of the distribution, and the variance for the Poisson distribution is equal to the mean. So these curves seem to get broader as they go up, but that's actually the variance is exactly equal to the mean for all values. So here's the way we do our measurement. We have a window that goes across, and we count the number of events in the window, and then we plot that repeatedly. Okay, now it turns out that not all processes are Poisson, although there are many that are, but there are also point events that are anti-clustered and clustered. And by that we mean when they are anti-clustered, that means that they are more regular than the Poisson. Here's the Poisson. The intervals between them are exponentially distributed. These are more regular, and when we have a clustered process, these are the events come in clusters, and we're going to see that in many situations in neurophysiology and elsewhere, we do have very clustered events, but in other examples, such as the heartbeat rate, we will have events that are anti-clustered. And so we can create anti-clustering from a Poisson distribution in two ways, and I'm going to come back to this later, so I mention it now. One way is to take the original Poisson process right here, it's homogeneous Poisson process, and we apply a dead time to it. That means whenever an event occurs, another event is not allowed to occur for a certain period of time. This happens, for example, in a photomultiplier tube where the carriers need to re-equilibrate, and there'll be a time during which we cannot see things. And as you can see, if each event creates a little time during which no other events can occur, we have a Poisson process which becomes less clustered, anti-clustered. If we want, we can do the opposite situation, and we can have a clustering that occurs because instead of being a homogeneous Poisson process, which means it has a fixed and constant rate, the rate could be fluctuating, and this happens very often. That will mean that when the rate is higher, we will get a clustering of events in this way, and there's different things. If it's a Poisson that we are modifying the rate of, then it might look something like this. An example of this, if the cars arrive randomly at a toll booth and we're in the middle of the night, they will arrive typically in Poisson fashion. But as the traffic increases toward morning when people have to go to work, there will be a peak here and the rate will go up and we'll see clustering of cars, and then in the midday the rate will go down and this kind of a thing. So these processes are very important, and two examples that are quite important is the dead time modification and these clustering of events. In particular, there's several kinds of rates here that we can use any stochastic process, meaning any random process, a process being a random value of the variable that evolves in time. Any process that has different statistics can be used to modulate this. And two of them that are particularly important, I'm just going to mention these, I'm not going to dwell on them. One of them is the negative binomial distribution that comes from a gamma distributor. This is for the aficionados among you. A gamma process here will give rise to a negative binomial counting distribution instead of Poisson because of the extra fluctuations, and of course it'll have a bigger variance. And another one is a Niemann Type A distribution here will arise when this stochastic rate is shot noise, which is a favorite, of course, of electrical engineers. Sir David Cox was the one who first developed the idea of the doubly stochastic Poisson process in 1955. So now that we have that little bit of a preliminary, let me give you a bit more of a friendly and discussion of how I got into this whole fractal thing to begin with. So in about 1974, when I was a young faculty member at Columbia University, I found that the president of the university at that time, Bill McGill, was giving a talk that sort of tweaked my interest. It was called Signal Detection Theory, and it was at a university seminar that was given over at the faculty house at the time. And I thought, let me just go over and see what this guy has to say. I'm curious because he was well known to be a mathematical psychologist, and I said, what is mathematical psychology? And then he gave a talk with a title, Signal Detection Theory, and I thought, gee, this sounds interesting. So I ambled over to the faculty house, and he gave his talk, and his talk was full of statistics and generating functions and models of Poisson and modified Poisson things. And I was astonished to find, as I listened to him, that the mathematics that he was putting up there to describe the model he had produced for the way the ear, he was a mathematical psychologist modeling hearing and vision, for the way the ear works, was that there was some noisiness coming into the ear, and usually in experiments, people use something like Gaussian noise, Gaussian acoustic noise, or a tone embedded in Gaussian acoustic noise. This is the kinds of experiments that were done in the 50s and 60s, typically. And then they study if the subject can hear it and how loud it is and other things of that kind. And so I was astonished to find that in the course of doing this analysis, he had taken this pure tone, meaning a tone that you produce acoustically, embedded it in Gaussian noise, and he had studied what happens when you take the modification of the rate of a Poisson process, this thing right here, and made it that kind of a distribution. And he produced results that were astonishing to me because at the very same time, I had been working, this is 1974, I had been working on a problem of modeling laser light, and the laser light was considered to be a pure tone, which was the coherent signal emerging from the laser, embedded in broadband Gaussian noise, which is the spontaneous emission in which the laser light, in which the coherent signal resides. And this interfering superposition was the same statistics that he had studied, and the results, since we were using it to modulate a Poisson process, the Poisson process being the electrons that were being pushed out of the photomultiplier, and so was he, we thought that there should be some connection between these. And he put up some results with confluent hypergeometric functions and other kinds of things. And in particular, he characterized things as the non-central negative binomial. And the measure that I was used to was either a generalized Laguerre formula or a confluent hypergeometric formula for this. And at the end of his talk, I went up and I said, you know, this is really quite remarkable. And he said, you know, let's talk about this. And so we began a long collaboration of 30 years or so at that time. And we began to teach a course jointly in the psychology department, electrical engineering department of Columbia. And that course dealt with students from both electrical engineering, my students, and his students from psychology. We put this all together and recognized that we could make an identity between the two things. So this got me excited about finding out what's going on in hearing and vision, and got me really in the early stages of my biomedical engineering career. About a little bit earlier, he had published a paper actually in the Journal of Mathematical Psychology in which he proposed, furthermore, that the way that the visual system might work, since there were photons coming in, was that perhaps there was a sequence of photons that would come into a receptive field in the eye, and then each one of those photons might create a sequence of neural impulses. In some abstract way. He just made a model of this kind where we had a Poisson here, and then each of these events could create offspring. This is a photon, and these are neural events in some way. And this was his model for what might happen in the visual system. Well, it turned out that this was very prescient on his part because, in fact, quite a few years later, in 1985, taking some data that had been collected by Barlow, Levick, and Yoon, some notable Barlow and Levick are quite famous neurophysiologists and vision people, and they provided the data. We were able to look at the counting distributions that we obtained from their spikes that were measured at the retinal ganglion cell, which is the second stage in, right after we have our first spikes coming out. And sure enough, this Niemann Type A distribution, which characterizes a doubly Poisson, did characterize the data. Let me explain a little bit more about this because it's very interesting. I find it very interesting in any case to go back over the years and to, in those days, go to the library and dig out all of these obscure papers that are fascinating. So Jerzy Niemann in 1939 wrote a paper in the Annals of Mathematical Statistics about a new classes of distributions that he had developed, the Niemann Type A, the Type B, and the Type C. I'm going to talk about the Type A right now, and here's how it works. He went and took a quadrat, or took measurements from a quadrat, and he noticed that the entomologists who measured the number of insects that were on these various hunks of land, and they were trying to develop the statistics of how many bugs, what's the probability of finding n bugs on a quadrat, a little piece of land. And they found it did not obey the Poisson distribution, and it kind of surprised them. So what Niemann did is he realized that if you looked at the egg cases that were on each little square of land, the egg cases did obey a Poisson distribution, and so the insect laid egg cases randomly throughout the land. But in fact, each egg case contains a random number of bugs that emerge from it, which is also Poisson, and therefore you have a Poisson egg cases, but each of the egg cases is, itself gives a Poisson number of insects, and so you have this doubly Poisson situation, which gives you much more randomness than the original Poisson that was expected. And this Niemann Type A distribution became kind of a basis for understanding a whole raft of things. As I'll tell you, it had a big influence in my career, actually, and I wanted to tell you about it. And here's the math for it. You have a conditional probability, you have a probability of the primaries, and then you have n secondaries given that you have M primaries, and it's kind of like a double Poisson. You can see the two Poissons, but there's an extra parameter alpha, which regulates the number of offspring per egg case, and you therefore end up with a distribution that looks this kind. And of course, it's broader than the original Poisson, as it must be, because you have more randomness and variability. Well, we made use of this, and one of my former graduate students, Paul Prusnall, who's now a professor at Princeton, worked with me on actually remeasuring the Heck-Schler and Perrin experiment of 1940, which was done at Columbia, in which we tried to see how few photons can the human eye perceive. And I don't have time to go into this now, but we carried out this experiment with laser light and with light that was non-Poisson for the first time, in order to try to shed some light on this process, and we succeeded in doing so, and the Niemann Type A played an important role in that. One of the most interesting things in which I was able to make use of this Niemann Type A was a surprise to me, and that is that the Galileo space mission, which went aboard the shuttle Atlantis and went into space in 1989, was its launch. It was conceived in 1977, and much of the work for this, of course, was done at JPL and Caltech. And these guys called me as a consultant to work with them because they were very perplexed and struggling to deal with the noise that the star scanner system had in the course of searching the Galileo mission. Here's a picture of the Galileo. The star scanner is right here, and what it does is it looks at the heavens. It has a map inside that tells it where the spacecraft is aiming, and so it enables it to direct itself properly to the right direction. Here's a blow-up of the star scanner, and you don't need to worry about the details of that, except in here is a photomultiplier tube. And what happened is we conducted a bunch of experiments in a laboratory at JPL in which we took a source of beta rays and gamma rays, and we allowed it to impact on the faceplate of the photomultiplier tube. Why would we do that? Because the Jovian atmosphere where this device is going, the Galileo spacecraft, is loaded with beta rays, high-speed electrons, and gamma rays, and these apparently have an effect on the noisiness of the photomultiplier tube, which you're trying to do to detect light in order that you can see the weak starlight and aim the spacecraft properly. So this was a real problem, and we went ahead and we measured what we got, and here's the Poisson distribution, the dash curve, again on a semi-log plot. And because I was familiar with the Niemann Type A, I was able to understand why the noisiness due to the beta luminescence that was put onto the faceplate of the photomultiplier tube in the laboratory at high energy beta rays radiated the photomultiplier tube in the laboratory at Jet Propulsion Lab, and this then gave rise to this, and we were able to understand exactly why we would have such a noisy situation, and therefore the photomultiplier tube had to be redesigned in order to make the glass thinner to eliminate the fluorescence photons that were coming. What was going on was that each beta ray would go into the faceplate of the photomultiplier tube, and then it would create fluorescence photons, copious numbers of fluorescence photons, which were the secondaries, and therefore we ended up with a primary Poisson of the beta rays, and the secondary Poisson was the random number of fluorescence photons generated, and the result was this Niemann Type A distribution. And because we had been working on dead time, we were able to use a fix for this that really solved a big problem. And the fix was the following. Since these events occur in clusters for the beta ray coming into the faceplate of the tube, and then a whole cluster of photons closely spaced come about, we were able to use dead time to get rid of a lot of the clusters and therefore reduce the noisiness here, because noisiness, of course, is bad. It masks the starlight image, which is narrower and less noisy. And so we modified the electronics right here, and that flew on the Galileo spacecraft, which, as you can see here, did a yeoman's job of proceeding ahead. It had really rudimentary, it was launched in 1989, it had rudimentary computer facilities compared to what we're used to now. Nevertheless, it took 14,000 photos and produced 30 gigabytes of data. So this is the Niemann Type A that we have, but Go ahead and laugh if you want to, it's all right. Out loud, that's good. This was then a generalization because the Niemann Type A is a distribution of the numbers of events. What we really want to have for various uses is to have the time sequence of events or the point process. And so in an accidental meeting in Toronto with the Optical Society in about 1980 or thereabouts, I was giving a talk about vision, actually, the kinds of stuff Prusnall and I did. And I had a bunch of good questions from this guy in the audience who was very polite but asked really penetrating questions, things that had been troubling me. And he just picked up immediately on these things, and I said, you know, this is really interesting. Can we meet afterward? It was Baha Saleh, whom I had never met. I knew his book, but I had never met him, and that was the way that we got involved together. And he was saying, you know, I really like your Niemann Type A things, and he says, but you know what? It's kind of a double Poisson if we can make a process out of it rather than just a distribution. By using shot noise as the rate of a doubly stochastic process, perhaps we can see the relationship between these. He says, why don't you go home and calculate the first 4 moments for the Niemann Type A, and I'll go and calculate the first 4 moments for this, and let's see if they agree and what's going on. And it turns out they did agree, and so we developed a new kind of a process called a doubly stochastic, shot noise driven, doubly stochastic Poisson process. And it's the same thing as I had before with the rate function being shot noise. And people who worked in doubly stochastic processes really hadn't heard too much about that, and they certainly didn't conceive of any uses, but here it was right here, and it became a really nice process where we have a sample function. Here's the instantaneous sample functions. This gives rise to the Niemann Type A, but if instead you have some impulse response function that allows, from the shot noise, that allows the secondaries to play out with some time dynamics, then you get a point process, and you can do all kinds of wonderful things with this. I can give you a bunch of examples, but I don't have time. One of the things we did immediately, since we now have the processes, we could see the interval distribution. That is to say, the probability tau of finding an interval of tau between 2 events. And there was some confusion in the literature about cathodoluminescence from work that was done at Phillips Laboratory, and this was TV screens in those days, which were cathodoluminescence because you had an electron gun shooting at the screen, a phosphor screen, and each electron would give rise to a bunch of photons, and so it's this doubly Poisson thing again, and we were able to solve that problem. Well, I want to say that generating clusters is not the only thing. As Ken mentioned, I also do a lot of work in the area of photonics, and in fact, we do work in generating a parametric down conversion, in which mother photons from a laser produce pairs of photons in a nonlinear crystal, second-order nonlinear crystal, such as lithium iodate or beta barium borate or something of that kind. And then they produce pairs that have entanglement because of the conservation of energy and momentum. This is energy because you multiply by h bar, and this is momentum because you multiply by h bar, and you can solve these things. And this has quite interesting properties of clusters as well, but it's clusters of pairs rather than clusters of Poisson numbers of events. And so this is kind of a Poisson primary distribution, but the secondary distribution always gives rise to 2 events. So with all of this, I began to wonder then, with the excitement produced by my new interaction with these psychologists, what goes on with the events that occur in neurophysiology in various domains. And so I put together a collection of discharges which are measured neurophysiologically using an electrode. These are for different preparations, and this one is Limulus, which is the horseshoe crab. These are the key people who did this work, and I've ordered them in order of increasing cluster behavior or increasing burstiness. And I just put this here to show you cat retinal ganglion cell, auditory nerve, spontaneous discharge, cat retinal ganglion cell, and a pyramidal tract sleep discharge by Everts, who was early in this game to realize there was this clustering. And so you get every manner of behavior, and I just began to wonder, you know, what are the counting statistics of these point events? Because typically, with the exception of Barlow and Levick, nobody measured the distribution of the number of counts in a time window, they always measured the inter-event interval histogram. And those two things do not provide equivalent information except in very unusual circumstances for special kinds of processes. And therefore, one has to be careful about this, and the counting distribution can provide additional information. And I began to work, I got excited about this, I began to work with a long-standing colleague named Sham Khanna, K-H-A-N-N-A, here he is. He was a professor at the Medical School of Columbia, College of Physicians and Surgeons, and we worked together for about 25 years or so. And we began to actually measure, we did experiments, and I became very familiar with all the techniques of recording and animals and this kind of thing. And we did an experiment in which we saw that I was curious what would happen as we changed the time window. We had a 50 millisecond, 200 millisecond duration time windows. At that time, I didn't realize that wasn't long enough, but we began to see some interesting effects such as clusters and some evidence of pairs. Why do I say that? Because you can see the peaks here, extra peaks at even numbers of events, and this is the probability of the number of events plotted against the number of events. And so this was an exciting prospect that spurred me on to study this situation more, and I began to wonder, is this some sort of a neural code? Are there pairs of events that are signaling something or other? And I took a look in the literature, and indeed there was a book that said, you know, pairs signal this and triplets signal that and stuff like that. So I said, is this possible? And it clearly was not pairs or triplets only. So I enlisted my student Bob Turcott, PhD student at the time, and we did a long study in which we used multinomial distribution to see if we could dope out when we got pairs, when we got triplets, when we got quadruplets, quintuplets. I think we went all the way up to quintuplets. And it was really a tour de force. And the results of that were disappointing in that we discovered that there didn't seem to be any pattern, but there were triplets and quadruplets of neural spikes that seemed to occur closely together. And so I began to wonder what is going on. Enter fractals. And so at about this time, in the late 70s, early 80s, Mandelbrot's seminal important book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, came out. And it opened up the eyes of a lot of people, myself included. I never have quite looked at the world the same way, even when walking to my car. And it was really quite something. And I think all of you know about fractals, and I want to just remind you that you take an object and there's a self-similarity feature. So here's a triangle, you put one upside-down triangle in this equilateral triangle. And then that forms three other triangles, and you do the same thing. You put upside-down triangles in here. This one is obviously smaller than the big one, these are smaller than that, and then here's more of these, and you put smaller and smaller. And so these things all have the same sort of behavior. They're self-similar to each other, and this is a deterministic structure. And you can create a fractal of this kind, and many of them have beautiful properties and so forth. Here's a generalization of it. Here's another example of something that looks more like a tree, where you have a branch here, and then at each point here you have another branch, and another branch, another branch, and so forth, and each of these branches kind of looks like a piece of broccoli or whatever, and indeed many natural things have this kind of structure. So there are several kinds of forms of fractals. Fractals can be deterministic, as what I've shown you here. They can also be random, as we will see in the case of the results we're going to show in various areas. They can be static, or they can arise from dynamical processes in many, many areas. Furthermore, they have cutoffs, meaning that you will not see fractal behavior smaller than a certain amount, and you will not see fractal behavior larger. Clearly, you're not going to see any of this self-similarity in an object that is larger than the size of this object governs how big you can get. So beyond that, you're not going to see self-similar behavior because there is no object. And below it, you have the resolution of your instrument that's making a measurement. So typically, you have both inner and outer cutoffs. But for the sake of the aficionados, I want to say that there are different definitions and different people use definitions, and I just wanted to let you know about these. Scaling is often used when there are both cutoffs are present. Fractal is often used when there is no inner cutoff, but it is also used when there are both cutoffs. And long-range dependence is a terminology that's often used when there's no outer cutoff. So this is the way a fractal works, and the random fractals that we have can be seen in volume, in area, in a form of a line. By volume, I mean this little picture we have right here, where you see that by looking back in the picture, effectively it's as if your vision is not so good because it's at a further distance, so you're looking with bad eyeglasses. And therefore, you're looking at a different scale. You're looking at a much larger scale than right in the foreground here, where you can see all the details. But the character is the same. It's a statistical similarity. Similarly, if we look at the coast of California and we look at it with different resolution, a high resolution or a lower resolution and so forth, we will have different measures of the complexity of the coast of California. In fact, Penck in 1894, who was an Austrian geophysicist and who spent a lot of time in the Alps, went ahead and discovered or recognized that maps of different scales, when he was trying to find his way, the coastline on the map seemed to be different length depending upon the scale at which you look. And in fact, it was Richardson in 1961 in a book published actually after his death. So this was a very prolific and interesting British mathematician, a Quaker mathematician who really studied war to a great extent, and the statistics of where wars occur and whether wars occur in countries that have more boundaries and borders. Very interesting history here. But one of the things he did is he showed that there was a formula in which the measured length right here, d, was proportional to the scale with which you made the measurement to a certain power. And basically, what we've done here is we've taken the coast of Iceland, 3 pieces of the coast of Iceland, and we've measured the length from 2 cities, Herfin to Seyðisfjörður, using different rulers. And if we use a long ruler here, 69.4 kilometers, we see that we get a short length, 133, and as we increase our resolution, of course, increasing our resolution as we travel from one point to another, we hug the coast more closely, and therefore we get a longer distance, and so forth, all the way up, 0.694. And we could go up to, in resolution, we can go down to the size of a grain of sand along the coast. So there is an inner cutoff for that as well. It would be the size of a grain of sand. And there's also an outer cutoff, and the outer cutoff would be the size of Iceland. This exponent here, the fractal exponent, for the particular case of the Icelandic coast, after painstaking calculation, we calculated to be minus 0.3. This has been done before by a number of people, including Benoit Mandelbrot, who studied this for the coast of Britain. But we wanted to do something a little original instead of just copying something. And so we took the coast of Iceland, which is highly invaginated with fjords, and we thought that that would be quite an interesting thing. And indeed, it is more irregular than most of the other things that have been done. So fractal behavior is ubiquitous. In mathematical and physical sciences, it just occurs everywhere. Nature, you know, another feature of fractal behavior is 1 over f noise, this ubiquitous 1 over f noise in electronic components in other places, and non-periodic layered structures and all kinds of places like that. And, you know, some of my colleagues work in different aspects of this. For example, Professor Dal Negro works in non-periodic layered structures, and Professor Reinhardt as well, both semiconductor structures and other materials. Errors in telephone networks, Cherenkov radiation is one that I have studied together with Steve Lowen, and earthquake patterns, etc. In the neurosciences, I'm going to give you a bunch of examples that I will discuss, and many of those we explored and discovered, and it's quite interesting that they behave in this fractal way. And even in medicine and human behavior, mood and human heartbeat patterns, and gait, of course, is one. Professor DeLuca and Professor Collins have studied this and been aware of it for quite a long time, and movement patterns influenced by drugs, and there's a whole group at McLean Hospital, Department of Psychiatry at Harvard, that studies some of these things, including Steve Lowen and Carl Anderson. So what we did to really get the ball rolling with this fractal stuff is I had a student at the time named Steve Lowen. He's sitting right here. And Sala and I had done this shot noise process, shot noise and shot noise driven process. And I thought, you know, is there a shot noise that can be explained in some fractal way? What happens, we asked ourselves, if the impulse response function, instead of being the usual one electrical engineers love, which is a little decreasing triangle or a square pulse or an exponentially decreasing little pulse, what happens if that instead is a power law decreasing function? And so we took a generic power law decreasing function with beginning A and ending time B, and this could be greater than 0, and this could be arbitrary as well. And we took a function of this kind, and lo and behold, the most remarkable collection of results came out of this for just ordinary shot noise, but shot noise with this impulse response function. And it's divided in this chart. I'm not going to go into the details. It's divided in the chart into what the endpoints are here, A and B. This is the characterization, and also what the exponent is. And found these remarkable things, that sometimes things converge to a Gaussian, as they do for ordinary shot noise. But many other times, there's no spectrum at all. Sometimes you go to a Gaussian and you get a spectrum that's not 1 over f. Sometimes you get a spectrum that behaves as a 1 over f to the alpha, in other words, 1 over f type noise spectrum, which is what we were looking for, because that's a hallmark of fractal behavior, the scaling. Anyway, there's a whole raft of possibilities here, and it turned out to be a very rich area in which we were quite surprised and pleased. So that's the piece now about fractals. Now, what I'm really going to talk about today for the majority of my talk is about point events. What I've been talking about so far in terms of fractals has been just generic fractals. And so both spatially, if we look at a galaxy and then we take a look at the stars using a microscope, telescope, and look more closely, then stars like galaxies tend to occur in clusters. So we get random point events in space that are clustered and have multiple scales. In fact, Niemann himself, together with Elizabeth Scott, worked on this problem for many years using a version of the Niemann Type A distribution in space, but they didn't do clusters of clusters. It never quite got to the fractal aspect of things. They just went kind of to the first step. So we do the same thing for time now. It's the same situation where we look at random point events in time as we did before, but we do it with different time windows. And when we do it with different time windows, the time window is the analog of the scale that we're looking at for these random point events. So we take a time window such as this, and we calculate all of the statistics. And then we take a time window that's longer and calculate things in the same sort of way. And we do things as a function of the time window, and yet a longer time window. And we see what happens to this. And the question we ask ourselves is, how do these rate fluctuations of this sequence of events change as the counting window itself changes? So the next slide I need to show you now is for the rate fluctuations, and this is for an auditory nerve fiber. What do I mean by the rate fluctuations? I mean, what we do is we take this window and we calculate the number of events, and then we divide by the time, so we have the rate of events in that window. And you would think, looking at this, that the rate of events would be, you know, relatively constant, but you would have fluctuations around it. So let's see what happens. Let's look at the right-hand side first and talk about a Poisson distribution, which we simulated. And here's the math for it. For a Poisson, the variance, which is the square of the standard deviation, is equal to the mean. The signal-to-noise ratio is defined as the mean divided by the standard deviation. Why? Because the mean tells you what the average value is, and the standard deviation tells you the fluctuations around it. So kind of, it's a signal-to-noise ratio, and that is to say, the bigger the mean relative to the standard deviation, the bigger your signal-to-noise ratio. And that goes as the square root of n. Why? Because, well, sigma squared is equal to n, so sigma is equal to the square root of n, and n bar divided by the square root of n is equal to the square root of n. And you all know that because this is the error business that we teach our students. And therefore, the signal, but if we talk about the rate is the number of events divided by the time, and therefore this is the mean rate, and the standard deviation of the rate is the standard deviation of the count divided by t, because lambda is n over t. And therefore, the standard deviation of the rate is the same as the standard deviation of the count, and it goes as t to the 1/2 power, because n is equal to lambda t. And since n is equal to lambda t, the square root of n is proportional to t to the 1/2. Thus, the signal-to-noise ratio for Poisson events, memoryless events, the Poisson is so important because it's the benchmark memoryless process, increases as t increases as a square root law. And here's the evidence of it. Here's 3 different windows where we've taken the same simulation, and let's look at 0.5 seconds. If the window is 0.5 seconds, the rate's the same. Mean rate's 100 something or other. The fluctuations are big if we have a small time window. As the time window gets larger, all the way up to 50 seconds here, what happens is that the t gets larger and it goes up as the square root of t, and the signal-to-noise ratio goes up. And you can see the signal-to-noise ratio goes up because that dotted curve is sort of constant. And this is what we do all the time. We average data in order to make the data smoother. And this is a natural thing to do. But sometimes it doesn't work. And many people think it works, and they don't understand. But it doesn't work. And here's an example. Here is an auditory nerve fiber. This is the 8th nerve, which is the auditory nerve fiber, in which we have the same period of time, 1/2 second, 5 seconds, and 50 seconds, and there is no averaging, as a matter of fact, so that the signal-to-noise ratio is essentially independent of the counting window. And this is collected right here in the auditory nerve. This is hard to see, but it comes right out of the cochlea, and it's the primary fiber bundle, the auditory nerve, and it consists of maybe 50,000 individual fibers. We take an electrode, we put it near one of the fibers, external to it, and we can see the electric currents, induces a current into the device that you're making a measurement with, the electrode, and you register it on a meter, and you see the sequence of events, and that's what we have collected this from. Well, we were emboldened by that to look further, and so seeing those kinds of results, I teamed up together with a few of my students, Steve Lowen and Connor Heenahan, with a guy named Udi Kaplan, who was a professor at Rockefeller University and Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And he was doing a lot of experiments in the visual system, and we were very curious whether or not this carries over to the visual system. And the answer is yes. And so what we have here are a series of rate estimates, as you see, and we have on the right-hand side the shuffled intervals, which just make believe that's a Poisson process at the moment. I'll come back to this later. This is a surrogate data set, which we always use to validate things. And you see that for the Poisson process, sure enough, as you get bigger, the signal-to-noise ratio gets bigger. Here it improves a little bit, but not nearly as much as the Poisson process. Once again, for these kinds of processes, averaging doesn't give you everything you think or expect or hope. And one more example, in the course of working on this, we wondered, is it only neural spikes and neurophysiology that does this, or do other biological preparations do it? And so we teamed up with a faculty member in the Department of Biology at Columbia, whose name is Mu-Ming Pu, and he is a neurobiologist who is now at University of California, Berkeley. And a student of his, a PhD, MD student at the time, Sid Cash, who worked together with us in order to take a look at this. And what this was about then was a xenopus frog embryo kind of preparation. And in there, we have neurotransmitter exocytosis. Many of you will know, of course, that when signaling occurs in neural systems at the synapse, it often occurs in the form of neurotransmitter packets that are released from vesicles. And the vesicle dumps the packet into the synaptic cleft, and then it goes to the postsynaptic side of the synapse, at which point it introduces a MEP, miniature end plate potential of a kind. And that's what we're measuring here. And this is the miniature end plate potential current data. And what we're seeing is that for the unshuffled, the regular normal data, once again for 25 and 250 seconds, this is not neural spikes. This is another preparation altogether which exhibits the same behavior. This kind of fractal behavior where there's a scaling, a self-scaling, seems to be present everywhere we look. And then when we shuffle the data, we get the usual results we expect. So this is a very interesting result, which we published in the Journal of Neuroscience in 1997. Finally, I'll mention the human heartbeat, which I'll come back to. And in the human heartbeat, we see just the same sort of thing. If we take the rate estimate here of the heartbeat at 5 seconds, 10, 50, and 100, it remains just about as noisy, even though we're averaging over a much longer period of time. Whereas if we take the shuffle data, which is in which all of the occurrence time information is removed and therefore is similar to a Poisson process, things average just as you would expect. So we believe we're onto something, and what we wanted to do is be more quantitative about this. And so we went to a counting window. Instead of being just a square counting window, we went to a counting window which is a differentiating time window in order to get rid of non-stationarities that people could complain, including ourselves, might be contaminating our data. So we took this little window here, which is, for those of you in the know about time scale analysis, is a Haar wavelet. And we say that what we do is we add the number of pulses in here and subtract the number that are in here, and then we move to the next, add and subtract. So we're getting a difference at each point, and we look at the statistics of that difference. And that has behavior similar to the variance to mean ratio, but it is not constrained in the same way, in a way that I don't need to really go into right now. So what we do is we take this for a certain time, and we're adding in the clear window on top, and we're subtracting in the minus sign window down below. Right here's the minus signs. And we do it for a bigger Haar wavelet, and then we do the thing for yet a bigger Haar wavelet, and we plot the same sorts of things we did before, or we plot slightly different things, and let me tell you what they are. We have the variance here. We all know how to calculate the variance. You take the square, you take the average of the square minus the square of the average, and that tells you the width, or the clustering of the process. Because if they were all regular events, the variance would be 0 or near 0. And in this case, we take this Haar wavelet, we call it A of t, and we calculate things this way. And this has some very nice properties from a mathematical point of view that make it more desirable than just using the ordinary variance divided by the mean, which is what we call the normalized variance. Here we take this Haar wavelet variance and divide by twice the mean, because it's twice as long, and we call that the A of t, or the Haar wavelet variance. But it's a differentiating window, essentially, so it gets rid of non-stationarity of a polynomial order. So here's what we find now that we will expect to have if we have power law scale invariance. Pareto was a big fan of power law stuff, and he, at the end of the 1800s, Italian financier, I believe, he found that power laws apply to all kinds of things. So what we're going to see is that if we have 1 over f type noise, then we will have on a log-log plot, we will have a curve that decreases as f to the minus alpha. That's why we call it 1 over f type, because 1 over f noise strictly is f to the minus 1. But we seldom find f to the minus 1. We usually find f to the minus alpha, where alpha is some number between 0 and 3. And this other measure, which is the normalized Haar wavelet variance I mentioned a moment ago, should behave as t to the alpha, where t is the counting time window, and alpha is the same alpha as this. And to show you that these are self-scaling, these kind of power law functions, because this underlies so much of fractal behavior, this self-scaling behavior, we just take S of f here, divided by S of 2f. You take the value here, divided by the value here, and you find that you just get a constant, 2 to the alpha, no matter what f and 2f are. You always get a constant. So it has this self-scaling behavior. And the same thing for this. A of t divided by A of t over 2, when you plug it in here, it gives you a constant. So no matter what values you have here, where you are in t, you always get this scaling behavior. So this is independent of f and it's scale invariant, independent of t and it's scale invariant Alpha is called the scaling exponent, and this is the scaling range, the shaded. It's not scaling over here, and it's not scaling over here, because there's an inner cutoff and an outer cutoff, as I mentioned, that often occurs. So what we can say is that using those measures, we have enough experience to use various kinds of fractal rate processes that I've shown you, and I will show you more right now, to say that we would expect behavior like this if we have a self-scaling system. So let me talk about a few examples now. I'm up to the examples. And the work going on in the quantum photonics lab up there in room 733, where we do our down conversion, we do a bunch of other measurements. And interestingly enough, we were doing some work on optical coherence tomography, as Dean Luchin mentioned, and on quantum optical coherence tomography. And one of my students, Nishant Mohan, discovered that the noisiness was a bit too great when we used the time windows for our counts that were too long, and we were surprised about this. And it occurred to me that maybe we have this fractal behavior in this laser source. So let me show you what happens when we've done some preliminary measurements now. There's a lot more to do, but it's looking very interesting, and that is to say, at very, very low frequencies, we do get a power law behavior. This is a laser, which is simply a frequency doubled. It's a neodymium doped, neodymium ion doped. Yttrium vanadate is the host crystal, and it's doubled using a second harmonic generator inside the laser. The original light is at 1.06 micrometer wavelength in the near infrared. You double it to 0.53, and it produces a beautiful green beam of 5 watts power or 10 watts power. That laser itself, which certainly has a few fluctuations on it due to the electric current, you know, the 60 cycles and so forth, but remarkably, we're seeing this kind of behavior, and for the normalized Haar wavelet variance, or the differentiating count window, we see the analog behavior right here, indicating that there is this type of fluctuations in there. I'll say more about that in a minute. The other thing we did is take an LED, a blue LED here, about 430 nanometer wavelengths, and similarly, it has the same kind of behavior. So we're onto a new little area of exploration and discovery here, which we've just begun to scratch the surface of. So what are the origins of fractal behavior? And there are many, and I can tell you a lot of them, but I don't have the time to do that. Rather, I'm just going to run through each one of these, can have a chapter written about it, but let me run through some of the things. Empirical power law behavior, because of the scaling nature, power law behavior occurs in many situations. Newton's law is a power law. It's a deterministic one, but power law behavior occurs everywhere. The diffusion equation leads to power law solutions. There is a superposition of additive independent processes that you add together that generally gives us the Gaussian distribution that we're so familiar with from the central limit theorem. What's not so widely known is that in order for that to be valid, you have to have a finite second moment, and there are other convergence laws discovered by Levy in the 1920s, 30s maybe, in which superpositions of distributions also lead to a superposed distribution that has a similar form, but with power law tails, but that's not a Gaussian. And so this is a reason by arguments similar to those for the central limit theorem, where you're adding a bunch of independent things that can give rise to power law behavior and fractal behavior. The log normal distribution, strictly speaking, will converge to Gaussian if you add 1 million of them, or no, not 1 million, 500 billion, but it converges very slowly, and it has a long power law tail that is sometimes can be look like fractal behavior. And the log normal is very important because it's like the normal when you take the log of it, which means if you have a product of independent random variables and then you take the log of those, then the log of the product becomes a sum, and if the sum is Gaussian, then the product will be log normal. So it's an important one. Atmospheric turbulence obeys the log normal distribution in many cases, and we did some experiments years ago on that. Then there are some other areas like self-organized criticality, highly optimized tolerance, and scale-free networks, which have become really important. I'll say more about those in a minute. So what kinds of models are there for fractal-based point processes? One is you take fractal Gaussian noise and you allow it to modulate a Poisson process. Remember, at the very beginning of my talk, I either took a gamma distributed noise, which is not fractal in any way, or I took a noise that was Poisson itself, or a rate here that was Poisson, or something similar to that. Now we're taking something that's fractal Gaussian noise, and fractional Gaussian noise, I should call it. And actually, I discovered in the course of working on this that although Mandelbrot and Van Ness were the ones who published the definitive long papers on this area, Kolmogorov, in a rather obscure paper in 1940 in the Russian Academy, had actually come up with the idea. There's also fractal renewal processes in which the intervals between adjacent events, independent intervals, but the intervals are power law distributed. That's another kind of process. There are alternating fractal renewal processes. Here's a couple of those. You add those, and since they're Bernoulli, it's either on or off. When you add a bunch of these at each level like this, each cut through right here, it'll either be a 0 or a 1, and therefore you're going to end up with binomial noise as the superposition of this. And that will be important too. And I also want to mention one more thing, one more model that's very important that I'm going to come back to at the very end of my talk, and that's fractal shot noise driven Poisson. It takes fractal shot noise as the driver. That's the stuff I showed you earlier. And it drives a Poisson process, and it gives us a doubly stochastic Poisson process, but it has special properties, and it will prove to be very important in computer network traffic. This will prove to be important in understanding the heartbeat business I'll come back to in a few minutes. So let me talk now about number 5, which is the second example I wanted to mention, which is heart rate variability. And this can be studied either via the counts or via the intervals. And so far I've talked mostly about the counts, but I'm going to talk about intervals in a few minutes. And what I'm showing here is the normalized Haar wavelet variance, such as I showed you for the fractal photons. It has a value of 1 at low values where there's no fractal behavior. And then when your counting window gets large enough so that the clusters associated with the large variations of the fractal intensity process can be observed, then we start to find this power law behavior. And this is a whole bunch of stuff. This is the synapse I showed you. We've also done experiments together with Ralph Siegel on the visual cortex. Computer I will talk about. We've done experiments with Kaplan on the geniculate and on the retina, lateral geniculate nucleus. That's one of the way stations in the visual system. We did experiments on the cochlea, and we also have done some heartbeat stuff. And you'll see the power law behavior here. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. And this is the heartbeat. And the heartbeat dips really down at intermediate values of the counting time because it's very orderly as opposed to the others. But don't let that fool you. Even though you're seeing this orderly sequence of events, nevertheless, it is fluctuating over long time scales. You can't see it with your eye, but it's fluctuating, and the rate is going up and down in a way that gives you this fractal behavior. So I'd like to talk just about one example of using this heart rate variability in congestive heart failure as a measure of being able to do prognostication and diagnosis. And so what is congestive heart failure? Some of you may know, but it has many, many different ways of presenting itself. And typically, your heart is not pumping enough oxygen to your blood. So you're short of breath, and fluid accumulates in your legs and your feet and your legs, and you feel tired and weak because you're not getting enough oxygen. And there's many ways of doing it clinically, as given right here. And the doctor does that, and he listens for your carotid pulse, etc. Or they take a radiograph and see if your heart's enlarged because it's been working so hard that it enlarges. Or they look at the electrocardiogram. And in the electrocardiogram, they look at what's called the QRS complex and see how it behaves. So here's an electrocardiogram, and here's the QRS complex. This is Q, R, and S. Give letters to these different peaks. And the doctor can tell if the cardiologist is a good diagnostician, he can tell if the shape of this is such that there may be a problem. Or if the shape is okay, then they'll use the other techniques as well, and they'll make they'll make a judgment based upon the collection of data that they have. In heart rate variability, what we do is we look at the intervals between the peaks here, the R to R intervals. And we look at the statistics of these intervals over a long period of time, maybe an hour or 2 hours or 24 hours with a Holter monitor, or even a shorter period of time, as it turns out. And what we find is that we can get good information from that, as I'm now going to show you, particularly about heart failure patients. But before I do that, I want to mention that I was giving a talk just on the heart rate variability stuff a couple of years ago down at Virginia Commonwealth University to a bunch of physicians, because they required to attend courses in order to keep themselves up to date. And so I was giving this talk, and it was a frisky group of physicians, and one of them in particular raised his hand right in the middle of my talk, and he said, whose electrocardiogram is that? And I said, it's mine. He said, you better see me right after the talk. I looked at him, and then he had a big smile, so I was relieved, to say the least. Anyway, if we use this measure of the normalized Haar wavelet variance, this is a guy, Allen, who developed this variance in an early situation, and we take a whole data set from the Beth Israel study, the Boston Beth Israel study of heart failure patients and normals. And we take this and we plot this entire thing. We find that sure enough, the slope of this curve for the dotted curves, the heart failure ones, typically are different from the normals. And you can see that the slope for heart failures are slightly steeper. So the slope, meaning this fractal exponent, can be used to discriminate between normals and heart failures. And so this became an interesting thing, and many people were trying to use fractal measures, many groups trying to use fractal measures in order to distinguish between these. But in the course of plotting this, something very tantalizing appeared that was unexpected, and it's right here. This little red region shows that at a certain counting time interval, there is a complete separation that is not scale independent, but depends on the scale. It's right here at about 10 seconds or 12 seconds that separates all the normals from the heart failures. So we said to ourselves, hey, let's just take a closer look at this and let's try to get a better measure of these different Haar wavelet matters, but let's try to get it so that we can see if we can really find a better separation between these somehow. And so what we did is we realized that if instead of working at the counts, if we go to the intervals, because the heartbeat is sufficiently regular over small lengths of time, that if we do that, we can get more information. And so we started looking at the interval-based measures, such as the periodogram, which is the spectrum. And there again, it's a scale behavior, and we see the scaling, which confirms that scaling is a way to discriminate, but still the discrimination is not so hot. And so what we began to do is to look at an interval-based Haar wavelet. Now, instead of the count-based Haar wavelet, which is of constant width, the interval-based Haar wavelet counts a certain number of events, 1, 2, 3, 4 intervals. And then it subtracts the next 1, 2, 3, 4. So they're of different lengths here. And then you add the next 4 and you subtract the next 4. And by doing that, you construct a sequence here which gives you the difference between the time between the first and the fifth event and between the fifth and the eighth event subtracted from it. And this time turns out to have magical properties. It is a Haar wavelet. And here's what we do. We simply take these intervals, and then we subtract this and so forth and so on. This is such a simple paradigm. Here's the complex mathematics for it. There's a picture of Haar, who is a Hungarian mathematician, by the way, was a Hungarian mathematician. And he was a student of David Hilbert, it turns out, which was quite surprising to me. And the way you calculate this is you do this for different scales. I'm not going to bother you with the math, but basically you change the scale. Here is your basic wavelet, and then you move the wavelet. This is -3, so you move it to a different place in the train of events, and you then can rescale it. And what you're doing is you're adding the times between 48 and 56. So you're taking the 48th beat and saying the 56th beat, and you just take the total time between them. And then you subtract the time between the 56th and the 64th. A simple subtraction of those two times, and that gives you, at this particular scale, the difference there that you use to calculate the Haar wavelet variability. And so that's what this is right here. And the details need not bother you too much, but what I'm plotting here is now the normalized interval wavelet variance A sub tau. And it doesn't have that big dip that was troublesome that we saw in the counts, because since we don't have the counting there that has a basic underlying discreteness to it that made all of the stuff come to one here, this gives us a longer, nicer flow of information, and it gives us better discrimination as well. So here is a picture then of these things for all of the same data sets we had before, plus a few others, a heart transplant, and and what we find is the scale-independent measures, which is this versus this, does work, but what works better, and look at this nice big separation now when we use the intervals, what works better is scales between 4 and 5, which means 2 to the 4 and 2 to the 5 seconds, 16 and 32 seconds, which matches with what we had from the counts before. But there's something magic about telling the observer if a patient is suffering from heart failure by means of studying the time between heartbeats in this range of 16 to 32 heartbeats. You just take the time between 1 and the 16th after, and you subtract from it the 16th to the 32nd interval, and that difference of time, the fluctuations of that difference of time, give you information about this kind of behavior. So what was fascinating is we published a nice paper on this in Physical Review Letters, and then what happened is that a Israeli-Danish study came along in 1998, and what they did is they used it for, I think, 250 patients, but instead of heart failure, they had preclinical diabetics. So diabetes often causes cardiovascular problems of various sorts. But if the diabetes hasn't set in very badly, you can't often tell by looking at the cardiovascular system there's anything wrong. But in this case, they were able to take this load of patients, and they were able to use diabetics and even some myocardial infarction and the normals, and they were able to get this separation just as we did in the very same region. So this was exciting and encouraging and very nice. The Haar wavelet is not the only wavelet. There's lots of wavelets, and Ingrid Dobschi is a famous mathematician at Princeton who has set up a whole bunch of different kinds of wavelets that are used for image processing. And so we wanted to make sure that we're not being fooled by just the Haar and that others work as well. And sure enough, this is just to show that the 10-tap works, but we did it with a whole raft of different wavelets, including the Morley and other things that all work beautifully. Well, we can identify patients with cardiac dysfunction in various ways, but I'm going to skip this part right now because one can do this using things like p-value and d-value and sensitivity versus specificity and the receiver operating characteristic, or ROC. And there are many ways to do that. Let me come to the bottom line about this without going through how we do this. This is Niemann, how we do ROC measures in the area under the ROC, which is a good way of doing it. And the bottom line is sort of that as the ROC area goes to 1, that means we have a complete separation of normals from heart failures, or any two groups. And we want to see how fast these things go to 1. Namely, this is plotted versus data length. So if you can have a short data length and you can reach 1, you're in good shape, because it means you don't have to take very much data, and you've completely separated the normals from the heart failures. And that's what we've done here, and I've put in yellow the ones that actually do go to 1 ultimately. And I've put in purple all of the ones that are scaling measures. And there's lots of them because there's all the slopes for the interval-based periodogram and for the count-based periodogram and for the normalized Haar wavelet count and the normalized interval wavelet count, all these in the spectrum, etc. None of them are very good. So this is a case where the fractal nature or the power law nature, which people were hoping and still hope, many still hope, they don't believe this or know about it, would be useful. And it turns out that the scale-dependent measures are really much better. And here are the ones that really work. And the best two of them are the wavelet variance I showed you and its analogous spectral feature. Those are very good, and this is just a better comparison. And to end my heart rate stuff, let me talk for just a minute about what the physiological origin of this might be, or what a possible physiological origin is. We all know that ion channels exist in excitable media, biological tissue. And ion channels, it turns out, have themselves a fractal behavior where they open and close randomly with typically 2 values, and there's a power law distribution between them. So if you take a look at the times between them, it obeys a power law. And so if we take this idealized little random telegraph waves, electrical engineers love random telegraph waves. If we take a random telegraph wave like this that goes on and off with power law intervals, and we add a bunch of them in this way, we get a sum of alternating fractal renewal processes. This is called fractal binomial noise. I showed it to you before. And if we take that and we have an integrate and fire mechanism, which is well known from Lapique's time in biological systems, then it turns out we have a fractal binomial noise integrate and fire sequence of events, and it's a very good model for the heart rate. So it might be that the fractal variability of the heart rate comes about because of the underlying channels in the heart, the ionic channels that have openings and closings that are fractal themselves. My final example is networks. And there are many scale-free networks that have come to the fore. Many of you are familiar with Facebook and LinkedIn and so forth. And those are examples of such networks that have scale-free behavior. Here's some other examples, the web, scientific collaborations, and businesses, etc. And these networks are actually robust because they consist of nodes that have sort of power law populations. And that means that some nodes will have extremely large populations, whereas others will be poorly populated. And if you have random faults, it's more likely to attack one of the larger sets of nodes, which would be poorly populated, and so it therefore doesn't have much effect sometimes. So what we do also is we use surrogate data analysis in which we shuffle events, for example, in order to see if the fractal behavior comes from the interval statistics, such as in a fractal renewal process, or from the ordering of events. And in most of our cases, it comes from the ordering. So let me say a few words about computer network traffic. What we did is we took a famous data set, it's called BCP October 89, that was collected on the main Ethernet cable of Bellcore at its input. And we took this data set and analyzed these 1 million consecutive packet arrivals over about a half an hour. And what happens is if we plot the normalized Haar wavelet variance, we get just the same kind of behavior we get for the heartbeat. If we plot the spectrum, we get the same kind of behavior. We get 1 over f to the alpha noise. We get a power law growth. And by God, it looks like we get just this fractal behavior. These are the guys who started queuing theory, which was the original progenitor of network traffic. So we see that, and we can actually go to a lot of trouble. You're not meant to look at these, but in order to really identify the point process, which is what we want to do, we identify it by looking at a whole raft of measures, not just the normalized Haar wavelet variance and the spectrum here, but there's lots of other measures, such as the interval spectrum and the detrended fluctuations and the R over S and the interval, sequence of intervals and the rate function. So there's lots you can use, And what you want to do is to identify a point process. It's very difficult, but it can be done by taking this collection of measures and going through a systematic procedure of taking multiple data sets, seeing the features they have, and then coming up with a model that obeys what you see. And that's what we have right here. And that's why I said that the fractal shot noise driven Poisson process was very important, because take a look right here. And this is a simulation of the data using this fractal shot noise driven Poisson point process with a rectangular little version of it. And we see that we are able to reproduce this pretty well. So we feel we have some confidence in understanding the nature of the process. I have to do this because you need to hurry up and buy our book. I just checked today. There's only 2,500 left. And Steve is right here in the audience, and this book really covers much of what I have said today, but a whole lot more, including detailed analyses and homework problems, and it's 600 pages long. So my last few words I'd like to say are about what I'm doing right now. And the intrigue that enveloped me way back in 1974 has continued, and I'm working on another book right now. This is my sabbatical year. I'm in residence at UC San Diego, and I'm working on another book called Sensory Transmission and Detection with Bill McGill. A lot of this has been carried out in the last number of years. Unfortunately, Dr. McGill passed away 10 years ago, but I'm working diligently and have been and will continue to. And we are about, maybe 75 or 80% through with this right now. And I want to say just a couple of words about it. You see, the fractal business takes us out in long durations in the time duration. Many responses, psychological responses, physiological responses, are over a shorter period of time in which you don't necessarily have fractal behavior. But what you do have is you have multiple stages of a system in which you have multiplication, because actually it appears that the various way stations in the auditory system and the visual system behave like amplifying way stations. I'll tell you why I say that in a moment. And so we have constructed a model, the beginnings of which are in this paper. We went back to the Journal of Mathematical Psychology, the beginnings of which are in this paper, in which you have events that start from the eye, let's say, and work their way back through the brain, and they multiply as you go across to the various way stations, becoming larger but also inducing more randomness. This is just like an optical amplifier, in fact. It's the same kind of mathematics in terms of birth, death, immigration processes. And so we take that kind of approach and we say that can we understand some of what happens with the various laws that one sees in the psychology of hearing and vision, such as, for example, Weber's law and the loudness laws and the brightness laws, which are power laws, and the square root law and the near miss to the square root law, and all of these laws, and we see if we can get that out of a system that behaves like this, and the answer is yes. But we want to have it physiologically supported, and with the recent explosion of functional MRI for making measurements, this gives us more ammunition now, because what we're seeing here in both the auditory system, in the Heschel's gyrus area, from these work of Hart, and also in the visual cortex at the back of the brain from the work of Aguirre et al. What we see is that, sure enough, as the intensity increases, the mass, the excitable mass of the visual cortex that is activated increases. And this is just along the lines of the models that we have had for the last 15 years or so, but we want to really support it by good physiological basis. Finally, I want to grateful I am to the supporters of my research. And in the end, I thank you for listening.
Well, you're not out of breath. I'm amazed. Time for a quick question or two, and then All right.
So, is global weather a fractal phenomenon? And if so, what does that say about our ability to detect global warming?
I don't know the answer to that. There are those who say that it is, and I suppose there are those who say it's not, but we might remember the butterfly effect, which was a nonlinear dynamical effect. And nonlinear dynamics is distinct from fractals in that it is a phenomenon associated with nonlinear differential equations. However, many of the plots and the results that you obtain in the area of nonlinear dynamics have fractal characteristics. And so therefore, there's a lot of confusion about this, but they're two separate things. And whether there are fractal aspects to the weather or not, I would say yes. My opinion would be yes. If you take a look at the level of the River Nile, the level of the River Nile is definitely a fractal process that obeys fractal behavior. So my guess is that weather in general would be yes. What does it say about global warming? Probably like the stock market, because the stock market, as Malebroach showed us, has a lot of fractal behavior, and that means there's persistence. And when things are up, they're going to be up for long periods of time, and when they're down, they're going to be down for long periods of time.
By the way, I wanted to remind people that for those of you who invited, the reception will be up in the 9th floor of the colloquial room of this building. Time for one more question, and we'll have to stop.
Thank you for that. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to ask a scientific question. But in your view, do the equations associated with fractals govern or describe behaviors that you talked about today? It's a philosophical question.
Yes. I would say that the behavior, some of the results I've talked about today are described by equations that have power law characteristics and fractal equations. Whether or not they are governed by such equations is, I think, a different matter that would require understanding better what you mean about that. Yes, there are some merits of fractal behavior, such as I mentioned in the network issue, where there is an imperviance to the destructive nature of random problems. And there's some similar things of that kind in the biological domain. We have a short paragraph on that on page 48, so perhaps you can have a look at that. I think you'd all be interested in that.
There's only 2,500 paragraphs left. Thanks again to Malvin Teich.